Dennis Rader was, by all appearances, a most ordinary man. The kind of man who smiled at neighbors while mowing his lawn, dutifully kissed his children goodnight, and arrived at church every Sunday with the punctuality of a Swiss watch. If anyone had dared to suggest that this unassuming fellow had a dark secret, they might have been laughed right out of Wichita. But Rader did have a secret, a most foul and ghastly one. Beneath the buttoned-up shirts and neatly combed hair was a monster lurking, a creature of cold calculation and bone-chilling cruelty. You see, Dennis Rader wasn't just a husband, father, and church leader. He was also the BTK Killer. And what, pray tell, does BTK mean? Oh, nothing too complicated. Just the three little words that describe his method to a T: bind, torture, kill. The phrase was so simple it could fit on the back of a postcard, though the deeds it described were anything but simple. No, these were acts of fiendish complexity, planned with the precision of a Swiss clockmaker and carried out with the relish of a chef perfecting his pièce de résistance. Now, picture it if you will. A quiet suburban neighborhood with tidy lawns and picket fences. Inside one of these homes is Dennis Rader, a man writing sermons by day and sketching out his murderous fantasies by night. His projects, as he so chillingly called them, were not just crimes, they were performances. Each one was meticulously scripted, every detail rehearsed, from the tools he'd bring to the notes he'd leave behind for the police. For more than 3 decades, Rader played his grim game. He stalked his prey with the patience of a spider spinning its web, striking fear into the hearts of the good people of Wichita. And the most diabolical part of it all? No one suspected a thing. You see, monsters like Dennis Rader don't leap out of the shadows with flashing claws and glowing red eyes. No, the scariest monsters are the ones who hide in plain sight, the ones who wave at you from across the street, hold the door open at the grocery store, and offer to help you fix your leaky faucet. But secrets, no matter how carefully guarded, have a pesky habit of escaping. And Dennis Rader's secret would eventually unravel, exposing a life so twisted it might as well have been penned by a storyteller of the macabre. So, settle in, dear listener, as we peel back the layers of Dennis Rader's double life. It's a tale of horrors and heartbreaks, of lies and lives lost. But most of all, it's a tale that reminds us. The greatest villains are not born from fables. Sometimes they live just next door. Dennis Lynn Rader was born on March 9, 1945, in Pittsburgh, Kansas, and raised in the small, unassuming town of Wichita. If you were to pluck a boy from a lineup and declare him destined to grow into a monster, you wouldn't pick young Dennis. He looked perfectly ordinary, polite, tidy, with a hint of the seriousness that would later define him. But appearances, as we know, are rarely the whole story. Dennis was the eldest of 4 boys in a family that might best be described as functional, though hardly warm. His parents were hard workers, but their love was the quiet, distant kind, which left Dennis hungering for attention. That hunger would grow into something far darker, like a seed planted in dry, cracked soil, small at first but persistent, reaching ever downward for nourishment. In his early years, Rader developed peculiar tendencies. He took an unsettling interest in tying knots, ropes, strings, shoelaces, it didn't matter. What started as a boyish fascination with binding soon evolved into something sinister. Fantasies of controlling and immobilizing others. By adolescence, these thoughts had deepened into a secret world of sadism. He tortured small animals, delighting in their helplessness. These were the first hints of the creature lurking inside him, a creature that craved dominance above all else. But in public, Dennis remained outwardly normal, blending into his surroundings with eerie ease. He went to school, made decent grades, and even joined the Boy Scouts, where his skills with knots were, ironically, celebrated. No one noticed the glint of something sinister in his otherwise unremarkable eyes. After graduating high school, Dennis enlisted in the U.S. Air Force, trading the quiet streets of Wichita for a disciplined life abroad. He served with diligence, completing 4 years of service. But the military wasn't a cure for his dark urges. It merely taught him patience, control, and precision. These traits, when combined with his fantasies, created a dangerous blueprint for the man he would become. By the time he returned home, Rader had learned how to blend seamlessly into the fabric of society. He married Paula Dietz, a shy, kind-hearted woman who saw him as stable and dependable. Together, they began building a life that seemed perfectly ordinary. But beneath the surface, Dennis Rader was more than ordinary. He was a storm in waiting, a man with a monstrous plan that would soon unfold in the most chilling way. Dennis Rader's first step into infamy was no impulsive act. It was a carefully crafted descent into darkness. He called it Project Little Mex. To the Otero family, it was simply January 15th, 1974, a typical day in their Wichita home. Little did they know, they were no longer a family, but a project. An unwitting cast in Rader's twisted theater of terror. Rader entered the Otero home that morning, armed with a toolbox of horrors, ropes, gags, and his unshakable intent. He quickly subdued the family. Joseph Otero, a robust Air Force veteran, was no match for the element of surprise and the weaponry Rader brought with him. As Joseph was bound and gagged, his wife Julie begged for their children's lives. Rader, however, was not swayed by tears or pleas. Rader worked his way through the family methodically, like a craftsman inspecting his work. Each knot he tied was precise, each action rehearsed in the twisted theater of his mind. He called his methods projects, and every project had rules, his rules. Joseph and Julie Otero were strangled before their children's eyes, their last breaths snuffed out by a man whose face betrayed no emotion. Joseph Jr., just 9 years old, struggled in vain against the bindings that cut into his small wrists. His murderer's hands were as steady as a surgeon's. But it was Josephine, the youngest at 11, who bore the full brunt of Rader's sadistic fantasies. He took her to the basement, where he hung her from a pipe. As she swung lifelessly, Rader stood back and admired his work. When he left the Otero home that morning, he carried no visible trophies, only the memory of what he had done, the rush of power coursing through his veins. Months later, emboldened by the success of his first project, Rader began stalking his next victim. Catherine Bright was a 21-year-old college student full of life and promise. To Rader, she was Project Lights Out. He broke into her home in April 1974, waiting patiently for her to return. When she arrived with her brother, Rader was unfazed. He attacked them both with chilling efficiency, stabbing Catherine's brother repeatedly until he believed him dead. Then, with terrifying calm, he turned his attention to Catherine. She fought hard, but Rader was relentless. Her screams filled the small house, but no one came. She died as Rader watched, her life extinguished like a candle snuffed out in the night. Rader's methods evolved with each killing. In March 1977, Shirley Vian became Project Green. Rader broke into her home, tied her up, and murdered her while her 3 terrified children huddled in the next room, powerless to save their mother. The details were ghastly. Shirley's body contorted in a final, desperate struggle against the bindings that held her. The sight of her lifeless form didn't disturb Rader. It exhilarated him. Later that year, Nancy Fox became his next victim. Rader referred to her as Project Lights Out 2. This time, he broke into her home, lying in wait like a predator stalking its prey. When Nancy arrived, he ambushed her, binding her hands and feet before strangling her with a cord. The final moments of Nancy's life were a horrifying tableau of desperation and cruelty. When the act was complete, Rader sat in her living room, savoring the silence. Before leaving, he wrote a poem mocking her death, a final insult to a life stolen. Rader wasn't content simply to kill. He needed the world to know about his acts, to recognize his work. He began sending taunting letters to police and newspapers, describing his crimes in stomach-turning detail. He signed them BTK, short for Being, Torture, Kill. In his twisted mind, Rader believed he was an artist, and his murders were masterpieces. In April 1979, Rader stalked and murdered 62-year-old Anna Williams, but this time his project took on a new level of depravity. After killing Anna, he returned to her home to collect trophies, items that once belonged to a living, breathing person but now served as reminders of his domination over her. Rader would keep these trophies in a secret cache, revisiting them like a child rereading their favorite storybook. Rader's arrogance grew with each crime, and he took greater risks. In 1985, he shocked his own neighborhood by killing Maureen Hedge, a woman who lived just a few houses down. Rader referred to this as Project Cookie. He broke into her home, abducted her, and strangled her to death. But he didn't stop there. He transported her lifeless body to the Christ Lutheran Church, where he was president of the congregation. Inside the church, Rader posed her body in grotesque positions, photographing her as though she were a prop in his macabre theater. When the session was over, he dumped her body in a ditch like trash. Rader's crimes didn't always follow a predictable pattern. In January 1991, he struck again, killing Dolores Davis, a 62-year-old woman. This was Project Dogside. Rader broke into her home late at night, using a cement block to smash through her glass door. The sound of the breaking glass and Dolores's panicked screams filled the air, but no one came to her rescue. He bound her hands and feet, strangling her until she went limp. For Rader, this wasn't just about killing. It was about control, about taking something that didn't belong to him. As Rader's crimes continued, his confidence grew. He began to see himself as invincible, untouchable. After each murder, he returned to his ordinary life, blending seamlessly into his role as a husband, father, and church leader. To the outside world, he was the picture of respectability. Behind closed doors, he relived his murders, poring over photographs, sketches, and journal entries documenting every horrifying detail. Rader's need for recognition became insatiable. In the late 1970s, he wrote a letter to a local television station, demanding attention for his crimes. "How many do I have to kill?" he wrote, "before I get my name in the paper or some national attention?" His thirst for notoriety was as great as his thirst for blood. And yet Dennis Rader remained a shadow, an invisible predator stalking the streets of Wichita. His crimes were not impulsive. They were performances, meticulously planned and cruelly executed. He left behind a trail of shattered families and a community gripped by fear, all while hiding in plain sight. With every victim, Rader's thirst for power grew stronger, his crimes more grotesque. Each act was a dark performance, leaving no room for remorse or empathy. The monster within him thrived, waiting for his next victim. Dennis Rader was a man of contradictions, a master of disguise who wore the mask of normalcy with chilling ease. To his family, friends, and neighbors, he was the very definition of an upstanding citizen. A devoted husband to his wife Paula, a doting father to his 2 children, and a committed member of a Christ Lutheran church. Yet behind this polished exterior lay a man who spent his days planning murders with the meticulous care of a craftsman designing his masterpiece. At home, Rader was the picture of suburban perfection. He mowed his lawn, took his children to school events, and never missed a family dinner. To Paula, he was a reliable and loving husband, if perhaps a bit strict. To his kids, he was an attentive father who attended scout meetings and cheered them on at sports events. The Rader family was the kind that people pointed to as an example of stability and success, but Rader's private world told a much darker story. In the quiet hours of the night, while his family slept, he would retreat to his study. There, he carefully cataloged his crimes in journals filled with chilling details. He kept trophies, stolen items from his victims, photographs, sketches, and even written fantasies about the murders he had committed or planned. These artifacts were his secret treasures, fueling the twisted fantasies that lived inside his mind. His job as a compliance officer for the city of Park City was yet another outlet for his need for control. Rader relished the authority his position gave him. He issued citations with a zeal that often unnerved residents, scolding them for minor infractions like overgrown grass or improper pet enclosures. Some even nicknamed him the Little Hitler behind his back. His authoritarian tendencies, which seemed like harmless overzealousness to his colleagues, were in fact echoes of the same monstrous need for domination that defined his crimes. And then there was the church. Rader didn't just attend services, he led them. As president of Christ Lutheran Church, he delivered sermons on morality, charity, and community, often with an air of righteousness that no one questioned. He was the kind of man you'd trust to babysit your kids or watch your house while you were on vacation. No one suspected that the man preaching the gospel on Sunday was the same man prowling the streets at night, hunting for his next victim. Rader's double life wasn't just a necessity to evade capture. It was a source of immense pride. He often bragged in his letters to the media and police about how he fooled everyone around him. He called his public persona a cubicle, and his dark side a compartment, as though his life was neatly divided into two distinct worlds. This was no accident. Rader believed he was superior to others because he could maintain such a perfect illusion. Even his family had no inkling of his dark side. His wife, Paula, who lived with him for over 3 decades, never suspected that her husband could harm anyone, let alone commit such heinous acts. His children described him as a firm but loving father, someone who taught them values and encouraged them to succeed. But there were cracks in the facade. Neighbors found his demeanor odd, even unsettling at times. His behavior as a compliance officer bordered on bullying, and some of his co-workers noticed his tendency to overstep boundaries. Still, these moments of unease were fleeting, dismissed as quirks of an otherwise ordinary man. What makes Rader's double life so terrifying is not just how seamlessly he maintained it, but how much he seemed to relish the deception. It wasn't enough for him to commit his crimes. He needed to live among his victims' families, to see their grief firsthand while pretending to share in their sorrow. He thrived on the knowledge that he could shake hands with someone at church and, in the same week, plot the murder of their neighbor. Dennis Rader's double life is a stark reminder that evil doesn't always come in the form of a shadowy stranger. Sometimes it's the man who helps you carry your groceries, the father who plays catch with his kids, the husband who kisses his wife on the forehead before bed, and it's that ordinariness that makes it so chilling. For decades, the BTK Killer taunted Wichita, leaving a trail of gruesome crimes and cryptic messages that seemed to mock law enforcement at every turn. Detectives scrambled to piece together the puzzle, but Dennis Rader, the man behind the mask, was careful. Oh, so very careful. His murders were methodically planned, his victims meticulously chosen, and his crime scenes left frustratingly devoid of usable evidence. The first breakthrough came in the form of his own arrogance. In October 1974, Rader sent his first taunting letter to the Wichita Eagle, detailing the Otero family murders. His tone was chillingly detached, describing his crimes with the precision of a craftsman explaining his trade. He gave himself a name, BTK, and seemed to revel in the attention, though he remained safely hidden in plain sight. Over the years, he continued to play a sinister game of cat and mouse with the police, sending more letters filled with details only the killer would know. He left clues, riddles, and even a poem mocking his victims. His ability to toy with law enforcement gave him a sense of power, and the media's coverage of his crimes fed his insatiable ego. The investigation spanned decades, marked by frustration and false leads. Police interviewed hundreds of suspects, followed countless tips, and even consulted behavioral profilers who described BTK as organized, methodical, and likely living a double life. Despite their efforts, the killer remained elusive. By the 1990s, the case had gone cold. Rader, content in his illusion of invincibility, lived quietly, focusing on his family and job. But the desire for recognition, his ultimate weakness, remained. In 2004, 30 years after his first murders, Rader reignited the investigation by sending a series of letters to local media. His ego demanded a return to the spotlight, and he couldn't resist the urge to boast. This decision would be his undoing. In 2005, Rader sent a floppy disk to the police, naively believing it was untraceable. But the disk contained metadata linking it to Christ Lutheran Church and a user named Dennis. Armed with this clue, investigators gathered DNA evidence from Rader's daughter and matched it to samples left at BTK crime scenes. On February 25, 2005, Dennis Rader was arrested. The man who had terrorized Wichita for over 30 years was finally unmasked, a monster hiding in plain sight. Dennis Rader's capture in 2005 brought a long overdue sense of justice to Wichita, but the scars he left behind will never truly heal. Families shattered, lives lost, and a community forever haunted by the realization that a monster had walked among them for decades. In court, Rader described his murders with chilling detachment, as though recounting mundane chores. His arrogance never faltered, even as he was sentenced to 10 consecutive life terms. His story is a grim reminder of humanity's capacity for deception and darkness. Evil doesn't always lurk in shadows. Sometimes it smiles at you from across the pew. Thanks for watching till the end. If you are videos, don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment. It'll inspire us to make more interesting Tiré crime story videos for you. Until the next time, thanks for being a part of Deadly Secrets.